Are you a fan of horror films? Or do you ever wonder, for those of you who aren't horror fans, why does anybody want to expose themselves to horror films? And what is it about horror films that's appealing to the average viewer? Like, why is it that we or anyone gets joy from such discomfort and sometimes terror and disgust? And what is it that brings us to the genre at all? And that is a compelling question to ask. And it's something that I have always wondered, because I'm always amazed every time I hear someone say that they don't like horror, whether it be in a book or in a film. Because to me, just that joy that comes from the discomfort of horror just feels so innate. It just seems so natural to want to feel that, and the fact that some people don't amazes me. I finally have some answers as to why it is that not everybody does feel that way. And while I'm not going to necessarily give you all the answers today, what I will give you is a review of a book that does a pretty damn good job of encompassing the entire conversation about why it is we love horror films and why they work so fucking well. And that is in my review of Nightmare Fuels, The Science of Horror Films. So a couple years ago, I read Danse Macabre by Stephen King. It is a nonfiction book about horror films in the 80s. It was written in the 80s, so it makes sense that he would be talking about horror films during that time. But I remember at the time being very disappointed in that book. It was very underwhelming, and it just felt very dated in a bad way. And like, sure, he was talking about movies in the 80s, but to me, even if he had centered his conversation strictly on films in the 80s, there's something about those films that should have transcended the moment. There was something about that message that should have been able to be relevant today. That fact that it wasn't just showed how that book really was just, there wasn't much to it. It felt very superficial, and it didn't really do a true service to the genre, because there is such amazing quality and talent in the genre, and I don't think King did a good job there. So I came to this book with that perspective, basically of that book leaving a bad taste in my mouth of books talking about horror films, because I didn't know what to expect. I had hoped for the best here, but to be honest, I didn't have that high hopes. And TLDR, it did what it was trying to do. It was fucking amazing. This book did what King was trying to do and so much more, and it did it in a much more effective manner, in my opinion, in a way that I think will really withstand the test of time. I think a couple of decades from now, if you want to understand the history of horror films and why they work so well from then to the 2020s, I think this book will do you just right. This is for all my fans watching decades down the road. So let's focus in on why this book works so well. Let's talk about what it actually is all about. So the name is obvious, like, it's talking about horror films, that's sure. In some sense, it's talking about the science of horror. Why is it that our brain reacts to horror in a certain way? What it triggers when we watch a horror film, and why that might seem appealing, why that might be pleasurable to us. As uncomfortable as it is, there's something pleasurable about the act of watching a horror movie. And she starts by just dissecting that basic fact of that dichotomy of this uncomfortableness and this pleasure overlapped with one another, juxtaposition of the two. Then she gives us a really deep dive into history. For me, I think it was the history that did it for me, that I realized this book was going to be better than just Stephen King's book. Like, Stephen King's book was all about history. And to me, even this chapter of history is going to be 50 pages, if that. I felt like she was talking about doing so much more with that discussion than King did in probably 300, 400 pages of his book, talking about just probably one decade of time. We see the slow evolution of horror movies, through time, and how we get to today. And it's weird seeing it laid out like that, because I love horror throughout the decades, and I always had a huge love of 80s horror growing up in the 90s. I guess seeing what led up to that and how things have evolved since then is really interesting, especially how we think about how it's evolved to what I would consider, oh, it was a spider, I'm scared, we're fine. I love horror, I don't love spiders. And seeing how it evolved into some of my favorite horror today. At times she talks about significant moments of horror, and she doesn't always mention my favorite thing, which I'm okay with, honestly. There's just so much out there to discuss that I think what she chooses to focus in on gets the point across. And then the rest of the book really fixates on the mechanisms of horror, the different types of horror that exist, and how horror makers make use of these techniques to accomplish different things. Each of these topics have their own dedicated chapter where she dives into how they work, why they work, and why we respond the way we do to them. And I think it's really interesting to dive into each of those topics, because horror is such a massive genre from comedy to body horror, whether it be Saw to Night of the Living Dead. There's just like the really bloody Nightmare on Elm Street, Hellraiser, to the more surreal, I guess Mike Flanagan works are more surreal, or even Ari Aster I consider more surreal. I can't do the genre justice here. All I can really say here is that by breaking it down into each of these categories, we begin to appreciate every component of horror and how they each add to the genre. Even if one may not be your favorite over the other, by talking about each one individually, we begin to really appreciate what makes that unique and how it's evolved through time and how filmmakers have made use of these techniques. The monster flick, the nature of sound. Like, I adore a good soundtrack, and a good horror soundtrack. Oh my god, it's so uncomfortable. I love around Halloween just throwing on some of my favorite soundtracks, whether it be Stranger Things. It Follows his soundtrack is fucking phenomenal. Like, just that slow build of that tense dread. Oh my god, I love it. Like, I've done so much writing to this It Follows soundtrack just in the background as they get more and more terrified. Oh, and then there's of course the iconic Halloween soundtrack. Like, that is iconic even for non-horror goers, I think. Same with Jaws, like the dunna 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 dunna, the way in which that music excites certain emotions. Like, every movie has music to ignite some type of emotion, and horror, I think, is especially impactful, especially important to evoking the type of emotions we need to feel. If you ever stop to just really listen to a good soundtrack, you can see like the techniques they use. It's just so unnatural, so unnerving and uncomfortable. And she even dives into, the author that is, she talks about our range of hearing in sound and how by going to certain levels that are not traditionally heard by us, or even going to levels just outside of our hearing range, such that like we get this sense of like this tingling. We recognize something's different, but we don't always recognize there's an audible sound going on. And that use of that technique of literally pushing the boundaries of what we can hear into the zone that is just very uncomfortable, it ignites its own unique visceral response. And that type of analysis, that type of deep dive into music, I think really makes you appreciate beyond what we already, I love a good horror soundtrack, but I appreciate better now why it works as well as it does. Like, why does it feel the way it does, and how are they making use of that art to do that? It's so good. It is perfection. Honestly, I would reread this book in a heartbeat. If there's anyone out there wanting to do a buddy read, I would totally do this, especially for November. It's perfect timing with nonfiction November, that is. Continuing, some scares stick with you. There's a conversation about horrors and about why some things keep us afraid long term. Like, I do not remember watching Interview with the Vampire. It came out when I was 4 years old, but I do remember around that age, maybe 5, maybe 6 at most, of having this recurring dream of Lewis and Lestat chasing me down to murder me. But I also remember going to my sister's bedroom and just lying on the floor next to her bed when she was still asleep one morning, because I was just so terrified of Lewis and Lestat. Like, it's not a scary movie to an adult. Like, I know it's intended to be scary, but to a kid, I should not have seen that. I tell you what did scare me as an older kid was the little girl from Sixth Sense grabbing the leg of the little boy. Like, rewatching as an adult, if you ever seen that film, that little girl just wanted help. There's nothing really scary about it. She just needed help. But years, I'm talking decades down the road, I feel this fear of stepping onto my bed because I'm worried somebody's going to grab me. And I think I've finally gotten past it, where I don't think about it every night I go to bed. But that's taken deliberate effort to resist the urge to just jump on my bed out of fear. And I think many of you understand this. Like, if you watched Jaws at a young age, maybe you were afraid of swimming in the ocean or something. She talks about these films that make that lasting impression, and she talks about why that is. Like, I know I'm getting into repeating myself at this point, but that diving into the science behind why something leaves that sort of scarring impact, and why, in my opinion, that is something to be admired. Like, my nightmare with Lewis and Lestat, I look back on that fondly. I'm sure it was traumatic as a child, but as an adult, like, fuck yeah, like that was a fun memory to have. And then blood, gore, and body horror. No, actually, violence and mayhem. We talk about violence, my mind goes to, honestly, the most recent Purge films, which are terrible movies. Like, what is about violence that just is exciting to us? And this one didn't spark much from me, but like, it was interesting. So to hear her talk about that, the idea of gore and blood, like, I love Hellraiser, and I love Evil Dead, these excessively gory films. I'm absolutely here for it. Body horror, not so much. Like, the idea of Hostel why I don't get those films of just body horror for the sake of body horror. I say it as someone who also does kind of love Saw. I always love Saw, but what is it about that makes it appealing is always a question that's always been in the back of my mind, even as someone who loves horror. That discussion was itself, again, an interesting discussion. Like, there's these questions in horror, like if there's something that maybe is too much for you, understanding why it works for some people is still a fascinating thing to talk about. I'm repeating myself, but still, like, I'm thinking about it and about what it is that makes it appealing to us, and it seems so antithetical to what it should be appealing, yet it is so goddamn appealing. Anyways, that's why I love this book. I don't know if this was the most coherent narrative. I might have to trim it down, reorganize it a bit. But this book, for horror film fanatics, fans of horror films, I highly recommend this. This will be a perfect gift, I think, to people that I know that love horror, because it is just really good. And if you ever wondered why it works so well, it's like you could tell this woman loves horror. It looks at it in a way that I've never seen done before. I don't see how you could love horror films and not love this book. Like, the two go hand in hand. It's one thing to love something, but to understand that love just brings, I think, a new level of appreciation to it. And that's why I think you should absolutely consider giving this book a read. The last thing I should say here is that I got a NetGalley arc of this book. So this review was from an arc, although I ended up listening to the audiobook. And the audiobook was honestly just as good as the book. This book could have been so dry as a nonfiction book. I think there's this innate excitement from the author and from us as readers as we try to appreciate everything that's being talked about. And I think the narrator does a really good job of taking in that emotion of what's being discussed, of every time we're talking about something uncomfortable, like, she gives the perfect tone of voice, the perfect way of saying something to add levels to it. Like, it takes the original text, which has its own level of excitement to any horror fan, and elevates it in a way that should be done by a good narrator. This is, I think, the perfect example of what makes a good narrator. So, phenomenal book. I highly recommend the audio as well. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this review, give it a like. Let me know if you will give this book a chance. And as always, hope you all stay safe, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.